Do you two know each other? David asked, his voice carrying that polite curiosity you use when you sense there's history between people but can't quite place it. I stood there in my tailored black dress, watching his face as recognition slowly crept in. The elegant ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago buzzed around us, but suddenly everything felt very quiet. Way more than you'd guess, I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. My name is Rachel Vance, and I'm 36 years old. 9 years ago, my family wrote me off as the ugly dropout who'd never amount to anything. Standing here now, watching my cousin Allison's fiancé realize exactly who I was, I felt a familiar satisfaction wash over me. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing up. I hadn't planned to come to this engagement party. When the invitation arrived at my penthouse apartment 3 weeks ago, I'd stared at it for a long time. Allison Hayes, my younger cousin, was getting married to some finance guy named David Mitchell. The same family that had cut me off without a second thought was now cordially requesting my presence at their celebration. My first instinct was to throw it away, but something made me pause. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the knowledge that I'd worked too hard to let them continue thinking they'd won. So I'd RSVP'd yes. And here I was standing in a room full of people who'd once treated me like I was invisible. David's eyes were widening now as the pieces clicked into place. I could see him connecting the dots between the successful businesswoman standing before him and the name he'd been seeing on company memos for the past month. His new supervisor at North Rice Financial. The woman who had just bought a controlling interest in the firm where he'd landed his dream job. Rachel Vance, he said slowly like he was testing the words. You're the new partner at North Rise. Among other things, I said, taking a sip of my champagne. The bubbles felt celebratory, even though this wasn't really a celebration for me. It was more like a long overdue reckoning. Allison appeared at David's side, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her engagement ring catching the light. She looked exactly like she always had, beautiful, confident, completely unaware that the world didn't actually revolve around her. She glanced between David and me with that slightly confused expression I remembered from when we were kids. "Oh, you've met my cousin Rachel," she said dismissively. "She's the one I told you about. The family black sheep who dropped out of Northwestern to take care of our grandmother." The way she said it, like I was a cautionary tale rather than a person, reminded me exactly why I'd stayed away for so long. Looking at Allison now, I could see she hadn't changed at all. She still had that casual cruelty that came so naturally to beautiful people who'd never had to fight for anything. But I had changed. 9 years ago, when I'd made the choice to leave school and care for my grandmother. I'd been 27 and desperate for my family's approval. Now I was 36 and owned 3 companies. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. When I'd left Northwestern in my junior year, my parents had been furious. "You're throwing your life away for a dying old woman." My mother had said, "She has nurses. She doesn't need you." But Grandma Helen had been the only person in my family who'd ever truly seen me. While my parents doted on Allison and her perfect grades, perfect boyfriend, perfect everything, Grandma Helen would sit with me in her garden and listen to my ideas about business and investing. She'd been a sharp woman even at 89, and she'd left me more than just her love when she passed. She'd left me $50,000 and a piece of advice that changed everything. "Don't let them tell you what you're worth, sweetheart. Show them." I'd used that money to start a small consulting business, working 18-hour days and sleeping on a futon in my tiny office. The family had written me off completely by then. No invitations to holidays, no phone calls to check how I was doing, just silence, as if I'd never existed. "So, what do you do now?" David was asking, clearly trying to navigate the sudden tension in our little group. "I invest in companies," I said simply. help them grow, improve their operations. Sometimes I acquire them entirely. What I didn't mention was that Northrise Financial had been struggling when I'd approached them 6 months ago. Their portfolio was bleeding money, their client base was shrinking, and they were desperate for an investor who could turn things around. David's new position was part of the restructuring I'd insisted on, bringing in fresh talent while I evaluated which existing employees were worth keeping. Allison laughed. That tinkling sound that had always made my teeth hurt. That sounds very official. Good for you, Rachel. I'm glad you found something that works for you. The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. She clearly thought I was exaggerating my success, probably imagining I had some small-time operation that barely paid the bills. David, however, was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the implications of what I'd just said. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, pulling out his phone. "I need to make a quick call." As he walked away, I watched him dial what was probably his assistant number. In about 30 seconds, he'd confirmed that Rachel Vance wasn't just an employee at Northrise Financial. She was the majority shareholder who'd saved the company from bankruptcy. The woman who now had complete control over his career trajectory. Allison was still talking. Something about wedding plans and venue selections, but I wasn't really listening. I was watching David pace near the windows, his voice getting more urgent with each word he spoke into his phone. 20 minutes later, David returned to our corner of the ballroom, looking like he'd seen a ghost. His face had gone pale, and there was a thin line of sweat at his hairline despite the air conditioning. He approached us slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. "Rachel," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Allison looked between us with growing confusion. "What's going on, David? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's fine," I said, setting down my champagne glass. "Of course, we can talk." We walked over to a quieter section of the ballroom near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago River. The city sparkled below us, all lights and possibilities. I'd always loved this view. It reminded me that there was a whole world beyond the narrow confines of family expectations. "You're her," David said once we were out of earshot. "You're the investor who bought into Northrise, the one who's been restructuring everything." "I am," I confirmed, watching his face carefully. He looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation in his head. "When I took this job, they told me the new partner was brilliant. Revolutionary, someone who'd turned around 3 other companies in the past 5 years. He ran a hand through his hair. "They never mentioned you were related to my fiancé." "Small world," I said with a shrug. "Chicago's not as big as people think." The truth was, I'd known exactly who David Mitchell was when his resume had crossed my desk 2 months ago. Allison had been posting about her new boyfriend on social media for over a year, and I'd recognized his name immediately when our headhunter recommended him for the senior analyst position. He was talented. I'd give him that. His credentials were impressive, and his previous work showed real promise. But I'd also known that hiring him would eventually lead to this moment. The moment when my family would have to confront the fact that the ugly dropout they'd written off had become someone they couldn't ignore. "Listen," David said, lowering his voice. "I want you to know that I had no idea about your family situation when I proposed to Allison, and I certainly didn't know about your connection to Northrise when I took the job." "I know," I said. "This isn't about you, David." "Not really." "Then what is it about?" I looked back across the ballroom to where Allison was chatting with a group of her friends, probably complaining about how long we'd been talking. She looked so confident, so sure of her place in the world, so certain that everything would always work out in her favor. "It's about truth," I said finally, "and consequences, and the fact that sometimes the people you write off are the ones who end up writing your story." David's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it. From his expression, I could tell it was probably another message from his assistant or someone at Northrise confirming what he already knew. His entire future was now in my hands. The next hour passed in a strange sort of dance. David returned to Allison's side, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing in my direction when he thought no one was looking. Allison, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware that anything had changed. She was in her element, showing off her ring and accepting congratulations from friends and family members I hadn't seen in years. I mingled carefully, reacquainting myself with relatives who seemed genuinely surprised to see me. Most of them had clearly forgotten I existed, which wasn't particularly surprising. When someone becomes inconvenient to your narrative, it's easier to simply erase them from memory. Rachel Vance. My Aunt Patricia appeared at my elbow, her eyes wide with surprise. I can't believe you're here. You look different. Different was diplomatic. 9 years ago, I'd been overweight, poorly dressed, and constantly anxious about money. Now I was trim, polished, and wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent. The transformation had been gradual, but the confidence was new. Success has a way of changing how you carry yourself. "Hello, Aunt Patricia," I said warmly. "You look wonderful. How's Uncle Robert?" We chatted for a few minutes about safe topics. Her youngest son's college plans, Robert's recent promotion at the accounting firm, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the questions she wasn't quite brave enough to ask. How was I here? What was I doing for work? Why hadn't anyone heard from me in so long? The answer to that last question was simple. Because no one had bothered to reach out. When my grandmother had been dying, I'd sent updates to the family regularly. Hospital stays, medication changes, good days and bad days. The responses had been sporadic at best. Allison had sent a few sympathetic text messages. My parents had visited twice in 3 months. Everyone else had simply carried on with their lives, treating Grandma Helen's decline like an inconvenience they didn't have time to address. After the funeral, the silence had been even more complete. No one asked how I was doing. No one offered help as I struggled to rebuild my life. They'd all just assumed I'd fade away into whatever failure they'd expected from me all along. "You know," Patricia said, lowering her voice, conspirator ally. "I always thought the family was too hard on you about the college thing. Taking care of Helen was admirable." I smiled politely, but internally I was amazed. Where had the support been 9 years ago when I'd actually needed it? Where had any of them been when I was working 3 jobs to pay for Grandma's medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover? When I was spending my nights in hospital waiting rooms and my days trying to figure out how to start over at 27 with no degree and no safety net? "That's kind of you to say," I replied. "It was the right choice for me." Across the room, I caught sight of my parents near the bar. They looked older, more tired than I remembered. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and my mother's face bore new lines around her eyes. For a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been sadness. These were the people who'd raised me, fed me, sheltered me for the first 18 years of my life. And yet, when I'd needed them most, they'd turned their backs. They hadn't noticed me yet, which gave me time to study them. They were talking to Allison's parents, my Uncle James and Aunt Carolyn, probably discussing wedding plans and guest lists and all the happy details that mark successful family milestones. Normal people having normal conversations about normal life events. I wondered if they ever thought about me, if they ever wondered how the daughter they'd written off was doing, if they felt any regret about the choice they'd made to prioritize their disappointment over their love. Probably not. People like my parents didn't spend much time on regret. They moved forward, convinced that their decisions had been justified, that I'd brought my exile on myself through poor choices and stubborn pride. Rachel. I turned to find my mother standing behind me, her face a mask of polite surprise that didn't quite hide her shock. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, which I suppose was fairly accurate. To her, I had been dead for 9 years. Mom, I said, keeping my voice neutral. How are you? I'm fine, good. She seemed to be struggling with what to say next. I didn't know you were coming tonight. Allison invited me. I didn't mention that it was the first invitation I'd received from any family member since Grandma Helen's funeral. No point in making this more awkward than it already was. My father appeared a moment later, moving more slowly than I remembered. He looked at me with the same carefully blank expression he'd perfected during the worst days of our relationship back when every conversation had been a battle about my life choices. Rachel, he said with a slight nod, you look well. Thank you. So do you. The three of us stood there in silence for a moment, surrounded by the warm chatter and laughter of the party. It should have been a reunion, a healing moment where time and distance had softened old wounds. Instead, it felt like we were strangers making polite conversation at a networking event. So, what have you been doing with yourself? My mother asked, her tone suggesting she was asking more out of obligation than genuine interest. I'm in business, I said simply. Investment and consulting work. That's nice, she replied, though her expression suggested she thought I was probably exaggerating my success. Are you still in Chicago? Yes, I have an apartment downtown. I didn't mention that it was a penthouse worth more than the house they'd raised me in. No point in being dramatic. My father cleared his throat. We heard you moved away after your grandmother passed. We weren't sure where you'd ended up. The careful phrasing didn't escape me. They'd heard I'd moved away as if it were some mysterious disappearance rather than a predictable result of being cut off from my family. As if they hadn't made it clear that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings. No longer included in holiday celebrations, no longer considered part of their lives. I'd traveled for a while, I said. Business opportunities in different cities, but Chicago's always been home. What I didn't tell them was that I'd spent the first 2 years after Grandma's death working in Milwaukee, then Minneapolis, then Kansas City, building my consulting business, one small client at a time. I'd moved constantly, partly for work and partly because staying in one place had felt too permanent, too much like admitting that my exile was real and lasting. It wasn't until I'd made my first $1 million that I'd moved back to Chicago. By then, I'd been ready to face the city where I'd grown up, the place where I'd been written off as a failure. I'd bought the penthouse apartment and started acquiring bigger companies, including Northrise Financial. Well, my mother said, clearly struggling to find something else to say. It's good to see you doing well for yourself. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken judgment. She still thought of me as someone who'd needed to prove myself, someone whose success was surprising rather than inevitable, someone who'd been lucky to land on her feet after making such poor choices. I was saved from having to respond by the sound of someone tapping a champagne glass across the room. David was standing near the center of the ballroom, Allison beside him with her radiant smile. They were preparing to make some sort of announcement, probably thanking everyone for coming and sharing their happiness. If I could have everyone's attention, David said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. The conversations gradually died down as people turned toward the engaged couple. Allison and I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate with us. I watched from my position near the windows as the crowd gathered closer. My parents had moved away from me, probably relieved to escape what had been an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. Aunt Patricia was taking pictures with her phone. Uncle James was beaming with paternal pride. When I first met Allison, David continued, I knew she was special. She has this way of lighting up a room, of making everyone around her feel important and valued. The irony wasn't lost on me. Allison had many talents, but making people feel valued wasn't one of them. She was charming when it served her purposes, but she'd never shown much interest in people who couldn't offer her something useful in return. But tonight, David said, and his voice took on a slightly different tone. I've learned something new about the Hayes family, something that makes me even more proud to be joining this wonderful group of people. He was looking directly at me now, and I felt a chill of recognition. Whatever he was about to say, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be the simple thank you speech everyone was expecting. Tonight, I discovered that my fiancé's family includes one of the most successful businesswomen in Chicago. Someone who's built an empire through hard work, intelligence, and determination. Someone who's proof that the Hayes family breeds excellence. Allison was looking confused now, glancing around the room as if trying to figure out who David was talking about. Her parents looked equally puzzled. Only I knew where this was heading, and I found myself holding my breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, raising his champagne glass in my direction. "I'd like you all to join me in recognizing Rachel Vance, who's not only Allison's cousin, but also the brilliant investor who saved my company from bankruptcy. Rachel, would you like to say a few words?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room turned toward me, and I could see the shock registering on face after face. My parents looked like they'd been slapped. Allison's mouth had fallen open. Uncle James was staring at me like I'd just announced I was from Mars. I took a step forward, feeling the weight of 9 years of silence and dismissal settling on my shoulders. This wasn't how I'd planned for the evening to go, but David had forced my hand. He'd made his choice to expose our connection publicly, probably thinking it would somehow protect his position at Northrise by showing that we were family. He was wrong about that. Family relationships weren't going to save his career if I decided he was a liability. "Thank you, David," I said, accepting the champagne glass that someone pressed into my hand. "I appreciate the recognition. Though I should clarify something. I didn't just invest in Northrise Financial. I own it. Controlling interest. Full operational authority." The second wave of shock was even more pronounced than the first. David's face went pale as he realized what I had just revealed. Not only was I his new boss, but I had complete power over the company's direction, including personnel decisions. As for saving it from bankruptcy, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Well, let's just say that sometimes the best investments are the ones where you can see potential that others have overlooked. Companies, like people, often have more value than their previous circumstances might suggest. I raised my glass slightly, meeting the eyes of various family members who were still processing this information. "To new beginnings," I said, "and to never underestimating the quiet ones." The toast was met with scattered, uncertain applause and a lot of uncomfortable murmuring. I could see people pulling out their phones, probably Googling my name and Northrise Financial to confirm what I just told them. In about 30 seconds, they'd find articles about the acquisition, business profiles mentioning my other companies, and financial reports that would make it very clear that the ugly Dropout had become something they'd never expected. David was still standing there holding his champagne glass, but his hand was shaking slightly. Allison had moved closer to him, her confusion now mixed with something that looked like anger. She'd always hated being upstaged, and I just turned her engagement party into my own personal revelation scene. "Excuse me," I said to the room in general. "I think I need some air." I walked toward the exit, knowing that behind me, the party was erupting into excited whispers and urgent conversations. Let them talk. Let them process. Let them realize that the person they'd written off as worthless had been building something remarkable while they'd been busy forgetting she existed. The hotel's terrace was empty except for a few smokers, and I found a quiet corner where I could look out over the Chicago River. The city looked beautiful from up here, all twinkling lights and endless possibilities. I pulled out my phone and made a quick call to my assistant. Jessica, it's Rachel. I need you to prepare some paperwork for Monday morning. Transfer orders for David Mitchell. I want him moved to our Akron office immediately. The David Mitchell who just started in the senior analyst position? Jessica asked. She was efficient and discreet, which was why I paid her well. That's the one. Make it effective Tuesday. And Jessica, make sure the transition is handled professionally. No drama, no explanations beyond the business need for restructuring. Understood. Anything else? That's all for now. Thanks. I hung up and stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the party continuing inside. In a few minutes, I'd go back in there and face whatever family drama was waiting for me. But first, I wanted to savor this moment of quiet satisfaction. David had forced my hand by making our connection public, but he'd also given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly how much power I now wielded. By Monday, everyone in that room would know that I wasn't just successful, I was untouchable. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Small groups of people were clustered together in intense conversations, and I caught fragments of whispered discussions as I passed. Always knew there was something different about her. Mother must be mortified that they cut her off. Heard she owns 3 companies now. David looked like he was going to be sick. My parents were standing near the bar with Uncle James and Aunt Caroline. All 4 of them looking like they were in crisis management mode. Allison was nowhere to be seen, but David was standing alone by the windows, staring out at the city with the expression of a man watching his life implode in real time. I approached him slowly, giving him time to notice me coming. When he turned around, his face was a mix of panic and desperate hope. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said urgently. "About what you said up there about Northrise." "What about it?" "You can't. I mean, my job isn't in jeopardy because of family drama, is it? Because I had no idea about any of this when I took the position." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd gotten engaged to my cousin without knowing anything about her family history, who'd taken a job at my company without bothering to research who owned it, who'd just publicly announced our connection without considering the consequences. "David," I said gently, "your job was never about family drama. It was about business. And from a business perspective, I think you'd be better suited to a role with less complexity." His face crumpled as he realized what I was telling him. The Akron office. It's a good position. Room for growth. Less politics. Behind him, I could see Allison approaching, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The real confrontation was about to begin. "But Rachel," David said desperately. "We're going to be family." I smiled at him, the same polite smile I'd been giving people all evening. "Actually," I said, "I don't think you are." In the months that followed, the consequences of that evening rippled through everyone's lives with devastating precision. David's transfer to Akron proved to be the beginning of the end for his relationship with Allison, who couldn't handle the embarrassment of her fiancé being publicly demoted by her own cousin. Their engagement crumbled within 6 weeks, and David found himself starting over in a new city, his reputation in Chicago's financial circles permanently tarnished. My parents and the rest of the family tried desperately to reconnect with me, sending emails and leaving voicemails that I never returned. They'd had 9 years to reach out when I needed them. Now that I didn't, their sudden interest felt hollow and transparently self-serving. Allison, stripped of her perfect life narrative, struggled to explain to her social circle how the family failure had become more successful than any of them. The confidence that had always defined her began to crack, and she eventually left Chicago entirely, unable to live in a city where everyone knew the story of her downfall. As I sit in my office now, looking out over the Chicago skyline that I once thought would never be mine to command, I find myself thinking about revenge and how it rarely unfolds the way we imagine it will. I'd never actually planned to destroy anyone. I'd simply focused on building something they couldn't ignore, becoming someone they couldn't dismiss. The real revenge, I realized, hadn't been in taking David's job or exposing my family's cruelty. It had been in becoming so successful that their opinions of me no longer mattered. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making others suffer. It's about making yourself untouchable.